Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight to celebrate Alison Townsend for her book, The Green Hour. Alison, thank you for joining us via Crowdcast tonight.
Thank you.
And we are also joined by Catherine Jago. Catherine, thank you so much for being our moderator this evening. It is lovely to have you as well.
It's a pleasure.
Great. As you know, I always like to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors for making these free cultural events available every year for the last 9 years, but particularly these past 2 years during the pandemic. Their support of free cultural events has been absolutely unwavering, and I can't thank them enough. So while you're at home, please, everybody, give them a small round of applause in your homes. I do also want to mention that we are just here at the beginning of our spring schedule for the Wisconsin Book Festival. We have more than 20 events coming up between now and mid-June. All of those events are listed at wisconsinbookfestival.org. I will put that in the chat when I'm done here. But we have wonderful, wonderful things, more memoirs, more poetry, more great books about Wisconsin. So please check that website and come back and see us either virtual events or in-person events throughout the spring. Thanks so much. Alison, I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this event for the Green Hour. It is my distinct joy as Wisconsin Book Festival director anytime we have a great book about Wisconsin. You and I know, have been talking about this book for a very, very long time. So often books that have this type of sense of place to them are almost always poetry, and so it is really refreshing and remarkable to see how you've managed to turn that into a memoir and capture some of those same incredible distinct things about where we live and why we live here. Thank you for this book. I will turn it over to Catherine, who's going to be our moderator this evening, and I will see everyone at the end. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was just going to give just a brief introduction to Alison, if for the people who may not have read her work before. If you're one of those people, you're in for a huge treat. Alison is both a poet and an essay writer, very accomplished in both fields. She's got 2 prize-winning books of poetry, The Blue Dress and Persephone in America. She also has a non-fiction chapbook, The Persistence of Rivers, which also won a national award. She's published in probably hundreds of literary journals, and she's one of the few people in the US to have been published in both Best American Poetry and Best American Essays, as well as the Pushcart Anthology. She is a teacher and a mentor to many, many people. She's now just recently retired, but she's a professor emerita of English at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where she taught creative nonfiction. And she and Tom, her climate activist husband, live on 4 acres of prairie and oak savanna in the Wisconsin farm country, which was the inspiration for her essay collection, The Green Hour, A Natural History of Home. And I have it here. It's just gorgeous, gorgeous cover. I think I'll just start out with questions, Alison, or did you want to say anything? Or
Well, I just want to thank you, Catherine, for joining me on this adventure. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have this discussion with Catherine. She's just the most astonishing essayist that I know. She has such a blend of lyrical, gorgeous writing and a critical acuity in her work that I just don't know anybody writing essays like you today, Catherine. So it's such a pleasure to have you ask me questions. Catherine is really, really accomplished. I think that any year now, there's going to be a book by her of essays. So please, Google her up after this event, and there's lots of stuff online. She is the author of the book Bloodroot, which is a gorgeous book of poems. It won the Settlement House Poetry Prize, and it also won the Council of Wisconsin Writers Poetry Award. She is multiply accomplished in both genres, poetry and nonfiction. And Catherine, I'm so grateful to answer your questions. Thank you.
Wow, you snuck a lot in there. Thank you for that. That was very kind of you.
Oh.
So let's start out by by just talking a little bit about how the book began for you and how it was written. How did it evolve for you? You wrote the book to better understand your search for home. Did you know that the book was about that when you began it, or did that only become clear for you while you were writing it? And I guess another question related to that is, did writing help you find or define home, and are you still homesick? A lot. So anything you...
Yeah, I'll dig down through the layers of that as best I can. I usually, I mean, when I write something, I usually don't know what I'm doing when I start writing. I mean, I begin in confusion, you know, something seizes me and I think, oh, this means something, and then I write to figure out what it means. I mean, the book really started when Tom and I bought these 4 acres in the country outside Madison, where it's on the north side of a drumlin, and we had been looking for a house for a long time, and I had never bought a house before either. So it was, even though I was in my mid to late 40s, it was quite stressful for me buying a house. And I talk about that in the opening essay of the book, but I didn't realize until I finished the book why buying the house was stressful for me. And it was because we were looking at the house right at the time of year, mid-December, when my mother had died when I was a child. And it wasn't until I finished the book that I began to put these 2 pieces together and understand something about what buying the house meant. But on a more immediate front, when we moved to this property, I had been living in Madison for about 12 years. And I grew up in rural places, Pennsylvania and New York State, but I hadn't lived in a rural place since leaving Oregon in the mid 1980s. And it was just so wonderful to be in the country again.
Mm.
And I began writing essays about things that I was noticing. I mean, I'm not from the Midwest. The prairie was new to me. Oak Savanna, which is on our property, was new to me. There were all these wonderful encounters with animals, sandhill cranes, deer, fox, coyotes. And so I began to write about what I was observing. Really, it just started in my journal as a way to get to know this place and a way to understand it. And, you know, then life being what it is, I was also teaching nature writing at the university, and I sort of forced my poor students, you know, on this journey with me. We kept place journals, which is a remarkable exercise for anybody to do anywhere where you're living. I highly recommend it. But that was how it started, and it started as individual essays. I had no idea that it was going to be a book at first.
Right.
You know? I did it one by one. Does that
Yeah.
answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting, slightly unusual, right? Because it's a memoir, but it's a memoir in essays. And I know that you wrote them over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And most of them were published individually. So they each function, you know, they certainly stand alone, or they did when they were published. And the thing that really struck me when I read the book for the first time is just the sheer gorgeousness of the language. I mean, your poet self is really in evidence in your prose, and also the depth and the breadth of the subject matter. You really deal with pain and beauty and marry them in these really profound ways. But the other thing, when I was rereading the book, I was really struck by just how carefully and how skillfully you knitted those individual independent essays into a coherent whole. Just even on a, like, thematically, by very small details, sometimes like single words that repeat or echo across the collection, like green, mother, home, place, loss, and map. When did you realize it was a book, and how did you go about constructing it?
Boy, I think it's probably taken me 10 years to write this book. I write all the time. I try to write every day, but I'm not a very fast publisher. And I think I try, I don't know, maybe halfway through that time, I began to think in terms of a book, but I began to think of, oh, I'm writing this ecological book. And I mean, I thought, oh, wow, I have a creative writing degree. I'm going to have to go back to school in order to write this book. I mean, I actually contemplated, getting a degree in ecology or wildlife biology or something to be able to do this. And, and I was working full time. I mean, I realized how crazy that was. So I think I wanted it to be a book, and I mean, I had other essays too that are outside the scope of this book's focus, and I began trying to force it to be a book really, I don't know, maybe about 5 years ago, maybe longer. And one poor, reader, I think I foisted 500 pages of essays on her, and I said, oh, is this a book, and she was like, well, it doesn't quite have a focus. And I slowly began to winnow it down. I mean, I was winnowing it down right up to the end when I chucked out a bad introduction that I had. So it took quite a while to sort of find the focus and then to order it. I mean, since I'm trained as a poet and the only books I published before were either that small standalone essay about rivers, which is republished in this book. I didn't know how to go about orchestrating a bigger book like that. I mean, as poets, we spread our poems out on the floor in our study and crawl around arranging them. And I couldn't see the whole canvas with a book of prose like this. So I did begin to look for themes, and when I figured out the theme of loss in it, that as a child, I lived on a small farm in Pennsylvania, the beautifully named Wild Run Farm. We all have places of our childhood, and that was mine. And we moved from there when I was 9, and my mother died just a few months later. So moving around, leaving place, and loss are equated in my mind. It's not rational, but it's very real to me. So I began to see that as a theme. I began to see the animals as a theme. I began to see green as a theme. But I'm amazed that people always tell writers things about their work that they don't quite realize is there. So when you said all those words, I was like, wow, they are all there, aren't they? Some of it was unconscious, but I did work really hard when I was revising it during the pandemic at home. I did work really hard to kind of, to eliminate any repetitions, because the essays had all been written at different periods of time, and to try to work some themes through there in a subtle way, because it's not a linear book. I mean, it isn't a straight, it's a book that begins and goes back in time and then goes forward in time again. So that's some of what, yeah.
And the first essay is called Genius Loci, that, Latin term. Could you tell us something about that concept and how you see it sort of informing the book, and maybe just read us a little bit, a short.
Sure. Yeah, sure, I can do that. It's, I guess the Romans sort of, they saw that as it's the spirit of place, and they felt that there was, a real spirit to a place. And I actually feel that too. I mean, I guess I see it as kind of, it manifests as our bond to the earth that kind of goes under the rational surface of things, our connection to time and history in a place. I think in one of the sections I'll read tonight, I mentioned the Native American concept of ceremonial time. I mean, I see that as being connected to genius loci. So I see it as being a very multi-level layered thing that, geological in a way, psychological and geological at the same time. And I do see it being embodied in different elements of the landscape. I mean, especially the oak savanna here, it's a interconnected arboreal system. So, and I can read a little bit from the first chapter, excuse me, which is called Genius Loci. So Tom and I, we looked at our house 6 times before we bought it, largely due to my hysteria over whether it was the right thing to do. So I'll just read a couple of paragraphs. And we were looking in the winter, excuse me. During our first visits to Deer Run, which is what we named the house, during our first visits to Deer Run, Tom and I concentrated on the house itself, opening closet doors and measuring rooms. But one afternoon, we walked around the property, slipping and sliding on snow and ice that had melted and refrozen. Standing under the bare oaks, which range from 150 to over 200 years old, I looked down the back hill at Island Lake, shimmering like a frosted jewel box across the fields. I envisioned the trees leafed out, a whispering green canopy that would shelter me in summer. I didn't yet know that this kind of landscape is an elemental part of our psyche, which some theorize dates from our origins in the African savanna. Tucked into the waving grass beneath the trees, we can look out from where we are and feel sheltered. Dappled with light, oak savanna is a mother grove, a refuge offering comfort and protection. Even in the middle of winter, I could feel that Deer Run offered exactly that. When I had been focused on the house, I hadn't reckoned with the power of the land, its particular genius loci. Standing there under the oaks, I felt a soothing calm that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I felt something flicker and turn over inside me, a green page I had not yet read, one I would come to know as well as the land here, all of it anchored by the largest, oldest tree at the bottom of the hill, the one we would later call grandmother in honor of her age and wisdom. I knew, standing there in the chill, the December wind cutting under the oaks, that we would buy the property. So I kind of had, I guess you could say, at the risk of sounding mystical, but I mean, I am a mystic, an encounter with the spirit of the place. And this, even in the winter, I could feel that the oak savanna was very powerful, and of course we know now from Susan Simard's work, about how trees are interconnected, through that huge fungal system. It's, these trees are all talking to one another. So that's some of it.
Yeah, thanks. That was beautiful. I want to just let the audience know that we would love to hear questions from you. If you are thinking of a question as we're going along, there will be time at the end. So do pop them in the chat and Connor will get them to me. I know that somewhere in the book, you say that you had moved 13 times before you came to Deer Run, and that landscape, the drumlin landscape, the glacial landscape that's come from somewhere else, is ended up being a very rightful place for you to be as a person who had been displaced so much herself. Let's talk about your mother a little bit, because even though the book is explicitly about place and home in the natural world, and not explicitly about her, she died when you were 9, she does play a really significant role in the collection. And, sometimes she just seems like this invisible presence or a spirit who is informing the book. Could you speak to that? Did losing her when you were that young influence your relation to place and losing places? I think you already mentioned that it did, that they were fused for you in this sort of primal moment of double loss.
Yeah, it did. I think, as I said, I equated, moving with loss. You move and somebody dies, which, I mean, certainly hasn't been the rest of my experience in life. I then moved around a lot with my ex-husband. Some of the moves that I didn't really want to make. But, you do that kind of thing, in a relationship. Years and years ago, when I think it was when I was finishing creative writing school, one of my teachers, Mark Doty, he was advising me on my thesis, which was, the beginning of a book of poems that would become the book of poetry about my mother. And he said to me, your mother is your tutelary spirit. And that was such a gift from him. I didn't quite know what he meant at the time, but I understand it better now. And I think one of the ways, losing a parent at that age deepens you, way before you're ready to be deepened psychologically. You're just trying to figure things out. But she taught me how to look at the world. I had her for enough years of my life that she really was instrumental in teaching me how to think about looking at the world. So I think that's one of the greatest gifts that I have from her. Should I read
there's that point right at the beginning where she suddenly, on the first page or the second page, where you suddenly have this realization about her? Would you like to read that spot?
Oh,
from
sure.
Black Raspberries?
Yeah, I can read that, and then I think maybe I can talk a little bit about it as the introduction to the book. Just get a drink of water here. I'm just going to read part of this. Black raspberries. I'm not thinking about my mother as my husband, Tom, and I drive past the overgrown woods partway up the long dirt lane that leads to our house. It's high summer in Wisconsin, and wild bergamot blooms in a lavender haze on the prairie behind us, filling the air with its spicy Earl Grey tea scent, the essence of this place and season. We're returning from a long hike. It's the end of the weekend. My legs are tired, and I'm thinking of all the things I have to do. Then, as if by magic, a whole family of sandhill cranes appears, the adults in Quaker gray plumage, the youngster about half the size of the parents, still a warm cinnamon brown. All of them capped in red, so bright, it looks enameled on. They're in the tangle of black raspberry brambles under the oaks where we've never seen them before, feasting on pebbled globes of ripe fruit. We watch, charmed, as their shiny beaks dart out like ebony needles, plucking the berries from the canes in one adept movement. Then the male steps away from the rest and begins to pace slowly up the hill ahead of us. Afraid we'll startle him with the car, I get out and follow behind on foot, careful to keep my distance, Tom creeping along behind me. The crane's legs unfold like lacquered black bamboo, each step deliberate. The female burbles, not the usual rattling crane call, but more a worried, "Where are you going?" murmur. Past the stately oaks, past the hickory saplings, past the old mulberry tree with a big limb arched low over the driveway, I follow, focused on looking. So quiet, I can hear the faint scritch of the cane's feet on the gravel. That's when it comes to me. My mother taught me this. A zoologist by training, an artist by inclination, a 1950s mom. She embodied the art of observation, an act of attention so deep and devoted, akin to prayer. The viewer vanishes into something larger. Look and see, my first grade reading book exhorted. Look and see, I read aloud to my mother, marking the words with my finger, then glancing up from beneath my lashes to see her looking, anchoring me with her attention, the angle of her gaze then lifting and opening across the woods and fields. The whole world was there to be contemplated. Everything was waiting to be noticed and seen. The proper attitude was wonder.
Oh, I love that opening scene, and I was also in awe of what you did with it, because especially in a collection of essays, I think the natural tendency is to think that the introduction is going to be kind of an expository. It's going to tell people what the themes are, and instead you chose, I think, really brilliantly to just make this a short scene, and you place the reader right in the scene, and the scene is on the lane going up to your house. So we see the location, and we're already in the prairie and with the cranes, with you and Tom. And I remember marking that the last word of that, it's only 1.5 page introduction, is home. So it's leading you to home. It just works really beautifully. Did you write that essay ahead of, was that one of the essays that was published, or when did you write it in the process?
Well, there's an interesting story behind that. It was the very last thing I wrote for the book. I did have expository introduction. I had many expository introductions, which were all just, I guess I was going to say they were all just really awful. Some were really awful. And I just felt like that wasn't, I knew I needed something up front to give the reader, a kind of, I don't know, like, when you're pushing off the wall, when you're swimming, to give them a place to push off into the book, and to at least suggest some of the themes of home and loss and paying attention. In many ways, this is a book about paying attention to what's around us in the world. The poet Nicole Brown talks about poets as noticers. I know you've taken a class with her too, and poets are noticers, and essayists are noticers too, but it's really about looking at the world. So I just wasn't happy with these expository introductions that I had, and suddenly I realized, like, oh no, it needs this tight, condensed, short thing that will help the reader enter the book. And I kind of see it as like a mini overture or something to the collection, and it's almost really more like a prose poem in some ways. But it was the very last thing I wrote for the book. I remember.
Yeah, that's amazing. It really is like a prose poem, but it works so beautifully for the collection.
Yeah. I remember I sent it to Dennis Lloyd. Dennis, I don't know if you're watching, but yay, thank you. He's the director of the University of Wisconsin Press, who really supported this book a lot. And he had some wonderful French phrase for what it was, that it was sort of the perfect morsel of food to whet the appetite. And I was so grateful to him for that description. So yeah, I'm sorry, Catherine, I interrupted you. You were about to something.
So readers, do be thinking about questions. We'd love to hear from you. You write about a lot of animals and plants in this book. Coyotes and cranes and white-tailed deer and great horned owls, tundra swans. Would you like to talk at all about how you approach writing about animals? Did you have to do a lot of research?
I did in some ways. I approached them as they appeared on the scene, kind of. I remember one of the first weeks when we were living here, we have great horned owls on this hill, and I had this feeling that I ought to go outside at night in the middle of the night, and this is the country, you can wander around in your nightgown outside. And, and there were three great horned owls sitting in a dead tree watching me. And it was just quite wonderful. And I mean, owls have so much, symbolic significance. Plus a great horned owl is just, they're such a stately bird,
Mhm.
And we later had a pair of them nested on this hill, and we watched them raise their owlets, which was quite wonderful. But I mean, I think it began with encountering the animal, having an encounter with the animal, and then because I was so aware of what I kept thinking of as my lack of a scientific education, I would try to educate myself as much about an animal as I could, so that I could then begin to sort of weave together, my poetic understanding of the animal with some actual facts about the animal. I mean, it's really important to me. I mean, Robin Kimmerer has that, she talks about the more than human world around us, the animate world around us. And I really see these animals as my fellow residents on this hill. And I often feel like, I'm disturbing them, I mean, yeah, the deer ate all my hostas last summer, but boy, they look tasty, and so it's been kind of a mix, but yeah, I did do research, but I'm a writer who, researches as I go along,
Yeah.
I would want to find something out about it, and then I, or something would happen, like the blackbirds came back and I, wanted to know more about them,
Yeah, there are so many essays that start with a visitation or a revelation or a scene that is sort of surprising or physically riveting in some way. Since it is the blackbirds, the red-winged blackbirds have just literally, they're just coming into southern Wisconsin now, the beginning of the migration. So it'd be great if you read a little bit about them.
Okay, I can do that.
It's in the 4 and 20.
4 and 20, yeah. I thought I was quite brilliant when I came up with that title. 4 and 20. So I'll read a little bit about that, and then I can talk a little bit about it too. And they did literally just come back. My husband, Tom, keeps a phenological notebook of when things happen and how much snow falls and when the deer do this. And they did just come back on March 1st, at least here. I don't know, they might be other places earlier. 4 and 20. It's leap day in Wisconsin, wet and muddy, and a south wind whirls wildly around my hill in dervishes that seem intent on driving winter away. With the wind come red-winged blackbirds, one of our earliest arrivals, flocks of them, hordes of them, thousands of black bodies that wheel and turn through the sky in great undulating clouds, wind-whipped and singing at the top of their lungs. Onclery, 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 they call, we're here, we're here, we're here. Their feathers shiny as anthracite, epaulets flashing like crimson silk shoulder pads outlined in daffodil yellow. They dart and flash among the trees, rising and falling together like fishing nets tossed out by a giant. Their wild voices fill my heart with hope. How is it they rise and fall so beautifully together? These sleek black swimmers navigating effortlessly in the clear sea of air. The flock assumes shapes so fast, one bird after another, that if I wished, I could read them as portents of some divine purpose, as ancient people might have. Here a teardrop, there a book opening, there a long fluttering sleeve from a magician's robe, and always the twisting cylinders that condense into lengths of shimmering rope strung across the sky, the birds moving as if they are one body and being, fluid, sinuous, organic? How would it feel to lift and turn as they do? Ecstatic, the one surrounded by the many. My voice a liquid burble, my bones filled with air.
Oh, I love that last image, my bones filled with air.
It's so great to be a bird.
Yeah.
Um, so that, I mean, what I'm describing, it's a murmuration, we have that wonderful word, and I say this in the little essay, I talk about it as a murmuration. But then I was curious. I mean, how do they know how to do that? How do they, because they just move so perfectly. And we see this with other animals too. Fish do it sometimes, swimming, the sort of synchronized swimming that they do. But, in the research side of that, and I didn't read this part of it, is, that there's a technical word for what they do, aliomimesis, and it's from the Greek, and it means mutual relation to one another and then imitating one another. And the birds navigate by watching what just 7 other birds around them do, and then the whole thing is working. So I didn't know that, until I encountered, I just was so entranced watching them. I was watching them just this afternoon fly up and down, from branch to the bird feeder, and all moving together so miraculously. So that was an example of one of the places where I had to do some research to better understand it.
I think that's one of the great things about the personal essays. It often starts with an anecdote or an experience, but you end up discovering so much that you didn't necessarily know in the process of writing about it.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing. And I mean, I often felt like I was being led, at least in this book, well, and in other essays too, led by elements that, in the landscape, led by naturally occurring phenomena that I wanted to understand better.
Yeah. Well, I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we open up to the audience. But turning away from place for a minute, sure. These are really personal stories. Obviously this is a book about place, but they reflect on issues like mental health, depression, a failed marriage, the loss of your mother. Can you talk a bit about personal writing and how risky did this feel to you? They were all separate pieces, but
yeah. I don't know how to write except very personally. I believe I had a wonderful teacher when I lived in California, named Holly Prado Northup, a wonderful poet who also wrote beautiful prose. And Holly always used to say, everyone's intimate history is a contribution to universal history. And I have quoted Holly, a million times since I first heard her say that. I mean, I don't even know if she made it up. It sounds like something Holly would say. And I think that the more intimately we write, the more deeply we write, the more universal our connection is. I mean, it's, I'm thinking about, what's going on in the Ukraine right now, and it's the haunting images of, a particular family but dead on the road, or a dog crossing the street alone, that stay with us. It's not the more generalized language. So I have a deep faith in personal writing. I had, both my poetry books were really, really personal. So I had gone into that territory before. I had to make decisions, in terms of other people in the book. I had to make decisions about, what it was my right to say, and what was maybe their story. So you know, there were times when it felt risky. I think you know, in retrospect, it seems like, oh, that wasn't so bad, you know, but there's an essay in there about having a depressive episode, and that was quite intense to write at the time that I wrote it. I think also that, you know, writing creates a container. I believe writing, you know, who was it? Isaac Dinesen said, if you can tell a story about it, no matter what it is, no matter how traumatic it is, that in a way that makes it beautiful. And I think that that's what all art is. It becomes a container for loss or sorrow, and the process of writing of any art is transformation. So, you know, to take that personal material and kind of run it through the fire and transform it, you know, it's a daunting thing to do, but I think it's important. And I tend to just rush in, you know, and you know, with my heart on my sleeve, and to write personally. But yeah, I don't know if I really answered that exactly.
Yeah, I know just many of your readers are just so grateful to you for, you know, being having the bravery to deal with some of the topics that you do, and I think you're right to say that the intimate is also universal, and if you know, that's what we're doing as artists, is it's trying to find the note that connects to everybody and not just our own story.
Yeah, you certainly do that in your work too. I mean, and we don't necessarily think about it that way when we're in the act of doing it. You know, I'm just sort of dog paddling along behind the writing, trying to follow where it's guiding me. I mean, I think the writing, I always feel like the writing knows a whole lot more than I do. You know, it's kind of, you know, leagues ahead of me. And I'm, you know, dog paddling or hiking along behind it, trying to get it down, you know. So, yeah.
There's so much in this book. I feel like there's this sort of movement between grief and love. Like there's love first, then there's grief, then you get moved, then there's love. You know, you moved from Pennsylvania to New York State, to Vermont, South California, Oregon, and each time you had one of those moves, there's this tremendous sense of loss and mourning, and then you sort of gradually put your roots down in that place and come to really love it, and then you have to leave again. And but in the sort of the first half of the book is about the experiences of moving and living in places before Wisconsin, and it's, you know, all of those essays are really beautifully rendered, but and I don't think I could choose between any section of the book, but I do feel like the second half of the book becomes this love song to Wisconsin, because it's somewhere you say something about attention, paying attention becomes devotion, and that's really, you know, you just pay this deep attention that becomes kind of spiritual and repays, you know, so amply repays the time that you put in, because then you do become enmeshed in the place and notice its patterns, and then you have this like essay after essay of beautiful place essays about aspects of living in southern Wisconsin that are just gorgeous. I know it's about 7:45, so Connor, are there any questions that we should be taking? So Jeannie Tomasco says,
Jeannie.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeannie.
Wait, it vanished again though. Hang on a minute. There we go. I'm curious about the title. Can you tell us about how that came about and how you settled on it?
You know, the title comes from, I'm going to see if I can find it. the title comes from a little description in the book, and I'm not going to read the whole thing in interest of time here, but I'm talking about my one of my favorite times of the year and the day, and I say I'm talking about the light and the way it falls over the land. And I say my favorite occurs in late spring. I call it the green hour. In early evening, the light slants low across Island Lake, the neighboring farm fields, and the wilder Department of Natural Resources land beyond them, illuminating everything so brilliantly. It seems to glow with the verdant radiance the 12th century mystic, healer, and philosopher Hildegard of Bingen called viriditas, or greening power. Each blade of grass, each leaf, each aspect of geography in the scene is lit so brightly it almost doesn't seem real. And then I go on to talk about it a little bit more. But so I had used the phrase in that paragraph, and this book had so many different kind of dumb names. Catherine has seen a number of them. I think it was probably called at least 4 different things. And Casey Lavella at the University of Wisconsin Press plucked the phrase "the green hour" out of the book, and suggested that as the title. And so Casey, I don't know if you're watching, but I have Casey to thank for seeing what I didn't see, because when she said the green hour, I was like, oh my God, that is it. That totally captures it, and then we found this really, really, really beautiful art. And so that's how that title came to be. I don't know, Jeannie, if that answers your question, but yeah, it was there. It was like a piece of green gold that I didn't know I had, so yeah.
Then there's another question. I don't know who this is from, but it says, you talk about being a canoeing enthusiast and particularly the Yarahara River. What is it about a canoe for you? Do you have a favorite canoe spot?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't know much about canoeing. I mean, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I spent a summer living on a pond in Vermont, in a cabin. There's an essay about it in the book called My Thoreau Summer, in a cabin where I didn't have any electricity or anything. It was it was one of those peak experiences of life, so I think that's where I began to love canoes. I was working in my college library, and rather than hiking 5 miles to go to work, I would canoe across this pond, and just hike a couple miles to go to work. So that was my first experience with canoeing. My husband is the real canoeist here in the family. He's been to the Boundary Waters a number of times, and he has a wonderful yellow canoe named Good Medicine. I love canoeing on rivers because I have a whole section about rivers in the book, because I love the way you never know what's around the next bend. But I have to say that one of my favorite places to canoe is on Little Island Lake. Tom portages the canoe down across our farmer neighbors' fields, and we just spend an afternoon sort of paddling around there, watching things. It's just right there, but I don't know if that answers the canoe question. I'm not a canoe expert, my husband's but we're a good team.
Yeah, you're lucky enough to live with one, right?
Yeah.
Here's another question from Amber. When writing, how do you determine how much description to include when describing the physical places you write about?
How much description to include? First of all, hi, Amber. Oh gosh, so good to hear your name and know you're here. The thing about description, I'm such a sensory world junkie. I mean, I could just go on describing the world forever. I mean, I love looking and absorbing everything, but too much description, I think, the reader gets overwhelmed, so I actually find myself having to kind of rein myself in. I mean, my worst tendency as a writer is to overwrite and overwrite really, really badly. And then my late friend, Catherine knows her too. We were in a writing group together. The poet Susan Albee used to say, "Oh, Alison, it's so much fun to slash and burn in your work." Susan was right. I mean, sometimes I do need to do some slashing and burning. And I hope I'm getting better at that over time. I mean, you want enough description that you give the reader a sense of where they are. As a reader, I find I get really bored if I'm reading something that doesn't have enough description. It feels flat to me. It feels like the sensory world is not there. And Amber, you've heard me say this. I think I probably said it in class. Everything we know comes to us through our senses, and I think that's true. So we need it, but we need just it's like making a recipe. How much salt to put in? Too much wrecks it. So yeah, a great question.
Yeah, you're lucky to be one of those writers that just will never run out of description. You always write so much that you have the luxury of cutting and picking and choosing. I mean, a lot of us are coming from the opposite extreme and trying to expand something that's too small. So
I don't think that's the case in your work at all. I mean, and I think that's description is also, I mean, it's my training as a poet. Poets are trained to notice detail. Yeah.
Here's a question from Judith Sornberger. Hi, Judith.
Judith, you rascal.
How much did early mother loss influence your need to find home in each location where you have lived? That's a great question.
Oh, Judith, honey, I should have known you would ask me a tough one. I think it had a huge influence on me. I mean, I think I said earlier, I mean, losing my mother was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I mean, worse than a nervous breakdown, worse than a divorce. And we heal and we move on from those kinds of things, but they stay with us. So I think home and mother, because I lost Wild Run Farm, and then she died so quickly thereafter, and I found myself living in town. Those two things are really knit up together for me. And I don't know, I mean, I hope it's not too big a generalization to say, but so much we know, I think, as women about making a home comes to us through our mothers, for better or for worse. So I think there's probably some aspect, of every time I make a home, I'm making a shelter, I mean, a mothering place for myself on some level, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if that answers that question. It's a really profound one. I'll have to write another book about it, Judith.
Yeah. Well, we have tons of questions, but sort of, I guess we could talk for another hour, but we won't. So I'll just wrap up by asking what you are working on now. You've just finished this project that took 10 years.
Yeah.
So does it feel empty, or have you already got things multiple, knowing you have multiple things on the go already?
It doesn't feel empty. I mean, I have another essay collection in the works called the Scent of Always, which is a title. It's a collection of coming of age essays. It was some of the 500 pages that I originally thought were part of this essay, and then I realized those are different books. I have a book of poetry that I'm working on called The Zoologist's Daughter. So I've got those. I've got, I'm always writing new things. Move back and forth between poetry and prose. So yeah, but I have those two book projects going, I guess you could say. I mean, I hope they don't each take another 10 years. I don't have enough life left on the planet to do 10 years on each of them, but that's kind of what I'm working on now. But I mean, the natural world is always, that's always there. It's always there in my writing,
Yeah.
I mean, just this week, I wrote a poem. I mean, I thought I was writing about spring, and it ended up to be about Ukraine, but it's always there,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Alison Townsend, thank you so much. I really hope that people go out and buy this book, because it is absolutely breathtaking. Thank you, Connor, and thank you to the Wisconsin Book Festival for hosting us.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, for such really brilliant questions. And like I said earlier, I mean, everybody go Google her up and go order her book of poetry too, Bloodroot. It's just hauntingly beautiful. And Connor, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. All I did was, run the Zoom. Thank you, Catherine, for all of your lovely questions. Thank you, Alison, for your lovely answers to those questions. And thank you to all of you at home. We had more than 115 people tuning in from all across the country to see Alison tonight and Catherine.
Wow.
So I love that we are still able to gather in these spaces in these ways. On Thursday night, if you happen to be in and around Madison, we do have Lindsay Christians for her new book, Madison Chefs. And we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, more than 20 other events happening between now and the middle of June. So please check wisconsinbookfestival.org. Alison, thank you for this book. And thank you, in advance for all of the other ones that you're telling us you're about to write. So.
Well, let's hope they see the light of day.
Well, that is always
I'm sure
the
it
hope.
will.
Thank you so
Catherine,
much.
you too.
The book festival is just such an amazing thing, and that it's free, and I mean, this is just phenomenal. I can't thank you enough. I know how much hard work it is. Connor talked us down from tech hysteria before
It all
the
worked.
event,
If the Zoom goes out right now,
and
we
it
made
all
it.
worked. Yes,
We did it. Told you it would work.
Thank you so much. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody. Mwah,
Good
to
night,
all of
everyone.
you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Step gently.